One of the things that's becoming more and more clear as we learn about Michael Cohen's sentencing memo from Robert Mueller, and as we see Donald Trump's erratic reactions, and we see conservative pundits like Jennifer Rubin say they predict that Donald Trump's going to resign and try to get a pardon from Mike Pence. In the midst of all this, this is a sort of constant that we see, which is that Donald Trump Jr. appears to be in really big trouble. Why do I say that? Well, because every new piece of evidence, every new piece of testimony, every new document that we see related to the Trump-Russia indictments look like they're saying that Don Jr. lied and therefore should be expecting an indictment. And specifically, it seems that Donald Trump Jr. lied to Congress about the Trump family's business in Russia. This is not like some esoteric idea. There are members of Congress who are plainly saying Donald Trump Jr. lied to us. Here's just one example. This is Democratic Congresswoman Jackie Speer. Check it out.
Do you think Donald Trump Jr. lied to your committee?
I believe he did.
About?
I don't really want to go into it at this point, but I think there's at least 2 occasions when he lied to the committee.
So in addition to these lies, there's more and more legal scrutiny over Donald Trump Jr.'s involvement in that Trump Tower meeting that we've talked about so much, which once again seems to have been much more significant than initially reported. Remember that Trump Jr. first said there was no meeting. Then he said, okay, there was a meeting, but it was about adoptions of Russian children. Then his emails were released, which confirmed that he had foreknowledge that the meeting was taking place with Russians, and it was specifically about dirt on Hillary Clinton. Don Jr. seems to know that he's in trouble. I think it was last week or the week before that I reported to you that he's been telling friends that he thinks Mueller is going to indict him. And the latest news is that Donald Trump Jr. is hiding out in Canada to avoid the media if and when this possible indictment happens, which apparently could be very, very soon. This is sort of like the last bit of this story. And the prediction is that the bomb is close to dropping and Don Jr. wants to be out of the U.S. when it happens. Gabriel Sherman, who has done some really good reporting on this, wrote in Vanity Fair that the Trump family overall is expecting things to implode this week or next week, and that Don Jr. specifically is saying, I'm out of here for now. We've been talking about this for a while, Pat, and I think in one of our polls, wasn't Don Jr. the winner of the most likely insider to next be indicted?
Yeah, so there was Don Jr., there was Roger Stone, there was maybe Jared Kushner, but Don Jr. certainly won out. And I would have to agree with that assessment.
Listen, maybe Don Jr. could seek asylum in Canada, claiming he's the victim of political prosecution, of course, by his dad's own Justice Department or something. Obviously, I'm kidding. Canada wouldn't accept that as an asylum claim. By the way, there's also an extradition treaty between the United States and Canada, so just hiding out in Canada also wouldn't work. The most interesting thing for me about a Don Jr. indictment is how it's going to set Trump off. I can only imagine, Pat, that Trump will lose his mind if Don Jr. is indicted, and it's going to be a new unraveling of tweets and obstruction, the likes of which up until now we've likely only dreamed of.
If this happens, I think certainly things are going to accelerate. Either Trump is going to think about or maybe act on firing Robert Mueller, or we at least know that Mueller is close to wrapping things up and coming out with his final report. Because if you're going to start indicting members of the president's family, I think you're pretty close to coming out with your final assessment.
Something to look forward to. I just hope that they include this in the finale of season 2 and don't wait until season 3 to get to this stuff, because I don't want to be kept hanging in that way over the new year. When the left and right are talking about impeachment and resignation, you know that the walls are starting to close in on the president. Everything we've spoken about today regarding the Michael Cohen memo, Donald Trump's failure to convince Mike Pence's chief of staff to fill in, to take the job of Chief of Staff John Kelly, which we'll get to a little bit later on in the show. Everything that's going on right now, this has led even conservative columnists to start thinking about Donald Trump's exit strategy. And there is a very interesting clip from conservative columnist Jennifer Rubin, who was on MSNBC. She laid out what she thinks will happen if in 2020 or 2024 a Democratic president wins the presidential election. which is that Donald Trump will resign 10 minutes before Mike Pence does so that Pence can issue a pardon to Donald Trump. So I want to be clear. I want to restate this. This is not the hypothesis of some fringe bleeding heart liberal. OK, I'm talking about Jennifer Rubin. She's a conservative columnist. She has many opinions I disagree with, but she writes for the Washington Post. She's an attorney, labor and employment lawyer for a long time. And the point is, this is a serious person with serious credentials who is not some kind of bomb-throwing lunatic left or right winger. And here is what she had to say about this.
I also don't think that Trump can pardon himself, and if he tries that, and that's his only mechanism, he risks being prosecuted after he leaves office. For that very reason, I would predict here on MSNBC that when Trump leaves office, he will resign the presidency 10 minutes before Mike Pence leaves office, allowing Pence to pardon him if there is not a Republican president to follow him.
The one area where Jennifer Rubin may be wrong, or at least underestimating the strength of that strategy, is that there are possible state crimes here. Those don't go away with a presidential pardon a la Richard Nixon. And this actually gets to one of the core issues within the resignation option. I've been pretty steadfast that if it comes down to it, Trump's not going to allow himself to be impeached. Donald Trump, I have held, will resign before impeachment if it becomes really clear that he risks being impeached. And he will couch the resignation as it's a crooked system. Evil Dems conspired against me, so I couldn't do anything. They put my friends in prison with these bogus witch hunts. And he will sort of frame himself as a martyr and say that he's resigning to fight back against a system that's treating him so unfairly. I mean, totally delusional framing, but it would at least allow some possibility of keeping the support of the Trumpist base. So that part, I think, is sort of realistic, that Trump would resign rather than be impeached. But the next question, Pat, is, would Mike Pence pardon Donald Trump? The implication from Jennifer Rubin is that yes, but as much of a disgusting ideological right-winger as Mike Pence is, we don't actually know how beholden he is to Donald Trump. He has been staying out of the limelight. Pence has been almost missing from the presidency. We don't know how compromised Pence is in the entire thing. I think there are some realistic questions, Pat, about whether Mike Pence would be party to this pardon and resign idea that Jennifer Rubin is presenting.
Well, you alluded to Richard Nixon earlier. A major reason why Gerald Ford wasn't elected for a term of his own was because he pardoned Nixon, and I think Pence would look at history and not want to find himself in the same predicament. Also, just going along with Jennifer Rubin's theory, I don't see why Mike Pence would need to resign. I mean, there's nothing, maybe we'll learn more about what's going on with the whole situation here, but there's nothing directly implicating him in any of the crimes that we suspect Trump and his associates of committing.
Yeah, I found that interesting as well that she mentioned that, because that has been a question for a while, and one could interpret Mike Pence's total lack of public visibility as a way to continue furthering the idea that he just has nothing to do with any of this stuff. It could also be that Pence knows he's as implicated as Trump, but he's not stupid enough to start tweeting and attacking journalists and making public statements, so he's doing the sort of more prudent thing by staying out of it. This is all totally speculative. But the mere fact that some more reasonable conservative columnists are starting to argue about how exactly this is going to happen is pretty telling. We have a new bombshell report in Newsweek, which claims that Republicans are more and more agitated by Donald Trump's problems and by the progress of the Russia investigation, which daily is tightening around Trump and his family rather than loosening, to the point that Los Angeles Times reporter Eli Stokols said on MSNBC yesterday that Republicans are privately telling him that if Mueller has more wrongdoing by Trump than just these felonies he directed Michael Cohen to commit, that if they obtain information that suggests Trump approved of wrongdoing or even had knowledge of wrongdoing, that they may dump Trump to save the Republican Party. Check out what Eli Stokols said yesterday to Nicole Wallace on MSNBC.
But when all the facts are laid out and people can see the investigators' work, I think it's going to be very problematic for this president. And there is some understanding, I think, inside the White House of just how dark it may be getting, especially in terms of conversations, private conversations that people there are having with Republicans on the Hill who are starting to be concerned, Republican lawmakers who have a huge role to play in this if it goes forward, are starting to tell me privately, some of them, that, you know, if there's obvious evidence, the bottom's going to fall out. They're not going to be able to stand by this White House, and that's a looming problem for the president.
So this is a reporter claiming it. There are right-wingers writing this off as merely made up, but this is not a pundit, right? Eli Stokols is a reporter for the Los Angeles Times. He has serious sources in Washington, D.C. He has no reason to make this up. The risks to him professionally to just making this up are huge. And more importantly, he's not really saying anything that's hard to believe. Privately, on the condition of anonymity, Republicans are telling him, we're aware of how bad this is. We're aware that if it gets bad and it gets worse, simply standing by Trump no matter what comes out would be bad for us. Obviously, right? Who could fault them for that? They care about self-preservation. They don't really care about Trump. Trump's not even been a Republican most of his life, and he has no particular loyalty to the Republican Party beyond it being the team that he chose to play on right now as President Trump. We would be expecting Republicans to be saying this. We stand behind Trump up until the point at which it becomes damaging for us and for the party, and then we're going to bail. And interestingly, Stokols said during the same MSNBC appearance that the Giuliani-Trump plan right now is to keep attacking the investigators. We've said this before, Pat, and we'll say it again. I don't remember who it was that tweeted, Sarah Huckabee Sanders maybe. When you're attacking FBI investigators, you know that you're in trouble. If your strongest tactic is to attack the people doing the investigation, you're not in a strong position.
It sounds to me like attacking investigators is a sign of weakness, a sign that they don't have anything, and a poor argument, really.
What we're seeing is the development of Trump from a sort of political curiosity into a political liability, which was predicted pretty early on in Trump's campaign, that this is what it would become. And there may even be some way in which Republicans, as they see the stock market become more and more erratic, as they see the jobs numbers fall further and further behind expectations, as they see the world laughing at us day in and day out, there are some Republicans who don't really care about Trump, who might be hoping that whatever Mueller comes up with is really serious and unequivocal and definitive so that they can say, listen, I'm a Republican and I like the president, but if he did something that bad, then he just has to go. Republicans may be hoping that Robert Mueller provides them cover to dump Trump. Now, what would it mean to dump Trump? Because that could take many forms. One would be related to what we talked about earlier. If the House does move to impeach Donald Trump in the new Congress, Republicans in the Senate could just get on board, right? They could vote to remove him, although for some of them, for many of them maybe, there would be political consequences to doing that. There are slightly more subtle methods that Republicans could employ. For example, they could communicate to Donald Trump that Republicans will not be supporting him in his reelection campaign. Instead, they're going to be supporting a challenger. Maybe Trump should consider not running and allowing someone else to run. These are all extreme scenarios, but we're increasingly sort of operating in a universe of extreme scenarios. They could negotiate. If you drop out of running for re-election, we won't impeach you or look to prosecute you after you're out of office. Many scenarios, but the fact that any of this is even being talked about means we're already starting to approach what could potentially be the end game phase of this national nightmare. Or maybe Trump just gets reelected and serves 8 full years and then leaves office and never faces any consequences. That's also a possibility. What do you think? I'm on Twitter at @DPakman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show, and we'll be back after this. There is a report, very interesting article, which we're linking to, which claims that Donald Trump is glued to watching the stock market and that he's starting to panic about his role in causing what appears to be a building recession, which is hard to believe for me only insofar as I've seen no evidence that Trump can actually self-reflect about how he does things poorly and about how he might be to blame for things that happen in the world. I've not seen any evidence that he's able to do that, but the facts are pretty obvious, right? The stock market is in chaos. Last week we had an 800-point drop one day, followed by a drop of around 400 points the following day. Stocks now are down for the year about 3.5% to 4%, not including the fact that as I speak right now, the Dow is down another 500 points. I cry when I log into my retirement mutual fund account. It's extraordinarily depressing. And in addition to that, you have stocks down more than 10% from their recent highs. So down about 4.5% for the year, down about 10 to 12% from their Donald Trump highs. In addition to that, we have a disastrous jobs number. We had a November jobs report where new jobs fell short of expectations by about 50,000 jobs. That momentum of job creation turned over to Trump by the Obama administration continues to trail off. 155,000 jobs created in November, about 50,000 jobs short of the expectation. Now, I have no interest in being deceptive about the numbers. Job creation is still better than job loss, right? So that's good. Just remember that the economy needs to create jobs just to account for the growing population, right? So the population grows. So in order to maintain an even unemployment rate, you need to be creating some jobs just to account for new people who are in the workforce because of population growth. Okay. There's now a report from the Wall Street Journal, not a liberal newspaper to be sure, which claims that Donald Trump is more and more panicked behind the scenes. He's watching the movement of the stock market very closely. He's asking advisors if his tariffs might be to blame for the economic turmoil. And sources are telling the Wall Street Journal that overall, Trump is still mostly blaming the Federal Reserve's interest rate decisions for the shaky stock market, but that the turmoil is starting to get even to Donald Trump. And that's a sign that things really aren't going well, Pat, because he doesn't exactly have a personality type which reflects about how he might be responsible for anything bad that happens. Even thinking about the fact that he might be responsible for this chaos tells us a lot about what's going on.
And if this gets very, very bad, I'm not sure what he's going to try to blame it all on. Like, I don't think that the Federal Reserve raising interest rates is going to be a point that sticks as to why the economy and the stock market are doing so poorly. He's going to have to come up with something better than that.
And I think it's probably accurate to say that instead of Trump is worried that he's causing the turmoil, it might be more accurate to say Trump is worried that other people will blame him for causing the turmoil, right? So along those lines, you could argue that this leak about Trump, quote, panicking about stocks and jobs is not Trump being worried that he's damaging the economy, but Trump being worried that others will blame him of that and that he doesn't actually believe it. Because again, there's no evidence that I've seen that Donald Trump is capable of the kind of introspection and self-reflection that this leak suggests he has, even though rational people, of course, realize that Donald Trump has kind of cornered himself by taking credit for things in the economy during his first year that really didn't have anything to do with him. The perception of Trump as an economic genius is now in question among people who actually were tricked into believing that in the first place. I'm not one of those people. Donald Trump obviously still wants to see himself as the economic genius, but he's starting to realize that others are going to start questioning what exactly is Trump doing that's making jobs reports get worse and worse? What exactly is Trump doing that's putting the stock market into a free fall? And in real terms, for any president, it's a bad idea to brag about the stock market, particularly when it's the stock market of the Obama economy that Donald Trump inherited. Trump owns the next 2 years of this term, and we'll see what direction that takes. And a really important note, and I want to make sure that I'm not ignoring this when we talk about stocks and job numbers. Many of the indicators that really relate to how the average person is doing are not represented from stocks and jobs. Wages, accessibility of healthcare, affordability of education, inflation, meaning how much things cost, inequality. None of that stuff is noted in these numbers, and those are extraordinarily important indicators. So yes, these numbers, stocks and jobs, matter. They seem to have Trump rattled. They are a part of understanding how the economy is doing. But there is much more that we need to look at to really do a holistic assessment of how the economy is doing. Send me your thoughts about this particular question. Do you believe Trump is actually capable at a sort of fitness level, a temperamental level, of considering whether his actions are resulting in bad things, or is this just a leak to try to make Trump look more introspective than he is? The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. I'm on Twitter at DPakman. I look forward to hearing from you. Okay, wait. If you're watching on YouTube and you've shown up to troll, before hitting dislike and leaving a negative, nasty comment, consider watching the video first, okay? I was really surprised over the weekend. People started sending me links to a tweet that Jordan Peterson sent out saying, David, you've got to talk about this dumb thing that Jordan Peterson said. And I presumed it would be some kind of esoteric, nuanced statement which could be interpreted 10 different ways, or I'd critique it and his followers would say, no, David, you're misunderstanding what he said, or that's not what he meant, or you just don't have the capacity to know what he's really talking about. But then I saw the tweet and I started to wonder whether something was wrong, because this is bizarre even for Jordan Peterson. And I'm going to explain this entire thing to you. And if you haven't heard of Jordan Peterson, he's a psychologist and sort of self-help dude whose teachings have really resonated with many young men around the world. He came to prominence for his opposition to a bill in Canada, which he said would threaten to jail people for using the wrong gender pronouns, which of course was never true. And Peterson suggested that misgendering people or using the wrong pronouns could be considered hate speech, which could conceivably get you jail time. But of course, misgendering people has never been considered hate speech by Canadian courts. Canadian courts have a really high threshold for what counts as hate speech. But the entire thing worked really well for Peterson to build him a big following. So he's doing very well. So anyway, over the weekend, Jordan Peterson tweeted positive comments about a guy named Bjorn Lomborg. For our discussion today, you don't have to know anything about Lomborg, because what matters is what Peterson said about him, which was via Twitter that, quote, he's casually called a climate change denier, for example, which is an appallingly treacherous term of criticism used to denigrate someone personally by associating them with Holocaust deniers. The ethics of anyone who employs it should be instantly questioned. So layer one is that in no way does calling someone a climate change denier imply or reference that they're in any way like Holocaust deniers. I mean, just in no way whatsoever. Contrary to Peterson's own views, he seems to have been triggered by innocuous language, climate denier, and he's trying to police language such that those whose views on climate change are not based on science are not called deniers anymore. And then he's also virtue signaling by calling into question the ethics of anyone who uses the term climate change denier. I look around, I looked hard, and there's no evidence whatsoever anywhere that the term climate denier is deliberately or even by sheer consequence referencing or implying anything like Holocaust denial. Peterson is arguing that calling people deniers of things is effectively an ad hominem looking to associate them with people who deny the Holocaust. I mean, it's patently ludicrous and absurd. Climate change, the latest neo-Marxist postmodernist plot, which is absolutely destroying the lives of young men everywhere by questioning the archetypes of dominant hierarchies. I guess I need to reset. I went into Jordan Peterson talking point coma there. So that's layer one, okay? I mean, truly just a dumb thing to say. But here's where it gets even better. In 2016, Peterson tweeted that a University of Toronto professor is a biological sex denier, saying, quote, you Toronto prof, a biological sex denier on Canadian public television with me. Jordan Peterson absolutely obliterates Jordan Peterson, right? He is now claiming that the phraseology of ex denier insert here, denier, is an ad hominem meant to link people to Holocaust denial. And he did the exact same thing when he called the University of Toronto professor a biological sex denier. How do people listen to this guy? I mean, truly picking and choosing when to be offended, going against his own stated principles, but more importantly, saying really silly things like calling someone a climate change denier when that's what they're doing. They're denying the overwhelming established science on climate change, is like likening someone to a Holocaust denier. And actually, Pat, many people in our audience may not know, but aside from his self-help ideas, Peterson has become a pretty stalwart climate science denier.
Huh, that's pretty interesting. You know, when you listen to Jordan Peterson speak, he often talks very slowly. He takes these long pauses, and you get the impression that he really wants to formulate his ideas and make sure that he's communicating clearly. And yet he seems to routinely have gaffes like these, like when he talks about enforced monogamy, or I don't know, many different examples, climate change denial, all this stuff. You wouldn't suspect that from someone who chooses his words so carefully, and yet Peterson repeatedly makes gaffes like these.
Yes, and here is another one. And if anyone wants to defend this, by all means, I'm ready to hear from you. And it is not just because he is on the right that I am talking about him. I also talk about people on the left who say things that don't make sense. And that's exactly what I'm going to do next, talking about Alexandria Ocasio Cortez. So I think everybody's going to end up upset with me because of this segment. We have big news to talk about today. We sort of are moving from, to make this an analogy to sort of a chess game, we're moving from the mid game to the end game. And in the fiasco that is the Donald Trump presidency, Donald Trump is now privately expressing concern that he's going to get impeached. Now, to be clear, I already know that if you're a Trumpist, you're going to call this entire story fake news. So don't even bother. Just skip it. Don't even bother writing to me about it. I know that you're not going to believe anything about this report. Now, for everybody else, let's actually talk about what's going on. There's a new report with multiple sources which tells us that Donald Trump privately is expressing concern about being impeached when Democrats take over the House in January of 2019. When it comes to why Donald Trump thinks he'd be impeached, it is only related to the campaign finance violations connected to Michael Cohen's felonies and guilty pleas. Trump does not think that he will be impeached for so-called Russian collusion or for obstruction of justice or any of that stuff. He believes it will be an impeachment solely because of the payoffs to former mistresses, felonies which Michael Cohen participated in, committed, under the specific direction of Donald Trump. Now, Trump likewise seems to understand that the House merely brings the impeachment forward. Ultimately, it would be up to the Senate to vote on whether to remove Donald Trump from office. Republicans, of course, hold the Senate. They're going to continue holding the Senate in 2019. Donald Trump does not think that Republicans would vote for his removal, except that there's another story from Capitol Hill today, which I'll talk about next, which might make us question that assumption. But I agree with Trump in a sense, which is that if the only incident at issue is that of the campaign finance related felonies that Michael Cohen pleaded guilty to, which we know that he did at Donald Trump's direction, I agree. I don't think that the Senate, a Republican controlled Senate, is going to vote to impeach Donald Trump on that basis. The more pressing question is, do we really believe that by the time it's all said and done, by the time Robert Mueller is finished here, that those felonies committed by Michael Cohen at Donald Trump's direction are going to be the only thing that we're going to have on Trump? I don't think that that's likely. It doesn't seem that Donald Trump actually knows the full scope of what Mueller has on him right now. The campaign finance felonies will be nothing if we end up with evidence of Trump trading promises of sanctions relief to a foreign power in exchange for help defeating Hillary Clinton. And we haven't even gotten to all of the obstruction. So if Trump's position right now is based on the idea that only the campaign finance felonies will be at issue, I tend to agree with him. He's not going to get impeached over that. The question is, what else will we know by the time it's all said and done? The obstruction fiasco, as an example, is well documented in the public domain, never mind what investigators have, which we just don't know yet at this point. I don't know what Trump's smocking, to take a vocabulary word out of his recent tweets, I don't know what Trump's smocking, if he thinks mistress payoffs are ultimately going to be the only issue here. Most of the Democrats I've seen interviewed so far, Pat, understand this is not the time to talk about impeachment. A couple of Democrats have talked about it. I think it's a strategic mistake. I believe at this point, what Democrats should be saying about what are you going to do once you take over in January, focus on what they want to do for the American people when they take over. Talk about what they want to investigate. The investigative power of the House is powerful. But let the facts lead them to impeachment if ultimately they will, rather than talking now about any plan to impeach Trump.
Yeah, I certainly think that most Democrats recognize that it would be a bad idea to impeach him, knowing that they probably couldn't get him out of office, that they couldn't get the 67 votes needed in the Senate. And also, if it was over something like campaign finance violations related to a mistress payoff, like a very similar thing happened with Bill Clinton in '98. He was impeached for lying about a sexual affair. This is kind of similar, right? It's the same kind of scope and scale, and I don't think they're going to want to repeat that mistake.
No, I think they're going to need more. And the one area where I disagree is if they have more on Trump by March 2019, June 2019, even if it's not something that would get Republicans in the Senate to act to remove Trump, I actually would be okay with filing impeachment, with moving forward with impeachment in the House, if it's the right thing to do. I just think that it's going to be a tough one to move forward on if all we have is these Cohen felonies, which Trump directed. But I am confident that there's going to be more. I would be shocked if there isn't more by the time it's all said and done. But the one thing I'm not mentioning here yet is, what if Republicans do decide that they're sick of Donald Trump? And that's what I want to talk about next. I know I'm going to get hate for this segment, but it has to be done. If I don't hold progressives to the same standards as conservatives, what am I doing, right? I agree with Alexandria Ocasio Cortez on many issues, but if that excuses her from critical analysis of what she's doing and what she's saying, I am doing a disservice to everyone in the audience and I lose credibility. So I'm not picking on her here. I know that she's new, but no one is forcing her to say the things she's been saying on Twitter and during interviews. She's a congresswoman-elect, and she is now subject to scrutiny. I care so much about the progressive movement that I don't want anyone, including her, going out and saying things that don't make any sense. Now, she recently tweeted that there's a double standard, that when Paul Ryan was elected to Congress at age 28, everybody called him a genius, but people are calling her a fraud for being 29 and having been elected to Congress. I never called Paul Ryan a genius. I'm not calling her a fraud. I'm merely analyzing her statements the same way I would anyone, with the context that I agree with a lot of reviews. So please don't lump this in with the irrational anti-AOC stuff that has infected the right. Let's get into it. First problem, AOC starts tweeting about Medicare for all. Great, full disclosure, I support Medicare for all. There's a number of very serious studies about how it is that Medicare for all would save us money in the net. And if you ask right now in the Democratic Party, who are some of the most prominent Medicare for all voices in favor of Medicare for all, Alexandria Ocasio Cortez is probably one of them. No doubt, that's great. I agree with the policy. But then she goes on Twitter and says, quote, $21 trillion of Pentagon financial transactions could not be traced, documented, or explained. $21 trillion in Pentagon accounting errors. Medicare for all costs $32 trillion. That means 66% of Medicare for all could have been funded already by the Pentagon, and that's before our premiums. This is really dumb, okay? This is silly. Her argument is, we don't even really need to worry about what Medicare for all will cost, because 2/3 of the cost could be funded from the missing money and accounting errors of the Pentagon. Now, it's true that there's a ton of money in so-called missing money, but it's not money that's missing in the sense that if you find it, then you can use it. There's a major problem here with the reasoning. There are transactions that are inadequately documented by the Pentagon. There is no evidence that the money is sitting around somewhere and could be used to pay for part of Medicare for all. This is just the wrong argument in favor of Medicare for all. This is based on just an incredibly simplistic misunderstanding by the Congresswoman-elect about what it means that the Pentagon has lost track of money. She's sort of furthering the idea that the 21 trillion might be just somewhere. And as soon as we find it, we can pay for 2/3 of Medicare for all. That's just not the case. We're talking about money that is improperly accounted for or tracked or documented. These are accounting issues. They're not, there's a pile of money sitting around. It's a really simple mistake, which she just can't be making. Okay. We have good ways to talk about paying for Medicare for all. This is a way to self-sabotage Medicare for all activism. Someone's just got to explain it to her. Now, somebody did apparently later explain it to her, and she followed up after being criticized by saying, well, I'm not literally saying use the missing Pentagon money. I'm just making a comparison about how the numbers being thrown around for Medicare for all aren't that much bigger than these so-called accounting errors. But it was too late. The initial tweet got all the attention, and she was flat out wrong. Nonpartisan fact checkers have no choice but to say this is wrong. And this is, you know, pants on fire for Pinocchios, whatever scale they use. And that's bad for the movement that I support. Next, she gets into it with Donald Trump Jr. on Twitter. Now, again, full disclaimer. I like Alexandria Ocasio Cortez. I agree with lots of her politics. I find Donald Trump Jr. to be a disgusting human being. I think he's committed crimes for which he will be indicted. But Alexandria Ocasio Cortez messed up again, appearing to threaten to use her political power to get back at Don Jr. for making fun of her on the internet. Donald Trump Jr. posted a disgusting meme about Alexandria Ocasio Cortez, which had a picture of her and said, "Why are you so afraid of a socialist economy?" Followed by a picture of Donald Trump saying, "Because Americans want to walk their dogs, not eat them." Now, of course, both communist and non-communist countries around the world sometimes have the tradition of seeing dogs as just another type of animal whose meat we might eat. It's not really a big political insight, right? So far, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has the upper hand. She's been targeted in a disgusting and stupid way by Don Jr., but then she tweets, quote, "I have noticed that Jr. here has a habit of posting nonsense about me whenever the Mueller investigation heats up. Please keep it coming, Jr. It's definitely a very, very large brain idea to troll a member of a body that will have subpoena power in a month. Have fun. Big mistake." I get it. Don Jr.'s disgusting. I can't stand the guy. He's posting horrible things. I support the House using its subpoena power for investigations. But this is an unforced error. We don't subpoena people for trolling online. We subpoena them because we determine that they should be subpoenaed for participation in potential crimes, knowledge about crimes, or for other reasons. The mere implication, Pat, that his trolling is something that might get him subpoenaed is an unforced error, completely misguided, and she really shouldn't be doing this.
Yeah, I think she absolutely should be doing better here, and maybe there's a case to be made that we should have some sort of farm league, right? Before progressives get into the upper ranks of Congress, they should first have some sort of training, maybe run for lower level offices so they can kind of build up that repertoire and all that experience. There's certainly a trade-off here because when you have younger, less experienced folks in office, they're fiery, they're creative, they can rally people behind them, but they're also more prone to making mistakes, and that's what's been going on here.
Yeah, and of course, there would be no way to enforce that farm league, but I understand what you're saying, that when you are sort of shoved into the limelight in such a prominent and rapid way, that this type of stuff can happen. And right-wingers now are saying she may have even broken the law by doing this. I don't think she did, but this is a completely unforced and avoidable error. And Friday, I'm going to deal with what she should be doing. But to sort of give you an overview, it's media training and getting more informed about basic economics and history and sort of how government works. I mean, there's no secret here. She's going to learn this stuff. And I say this all with peace and love. Lots of attention is being paid to her. I don't want her damaging the movement I support because she's making these mistakes, which make her a target in a way that is not necessary and is counterproductive. If you disagree, and I know many of you will, let me know. But my criticism here is not an attack on her. It's because I want her to be a steward of the movement in which we share so many ideals. Period. Full stop. That's my objective. Follow me on Instagram at david.pakman. The show is also on Instagram at David Pakman Show. Quick break, and then part 2 of my interview with Zoltan Istvan is coming up next. We could have had J.D. Scholten in Iowa's 4th Congressional District, but instead, incumbent, lunatic, outrageous, ideological, disgusting, neo-Nazi white nationalist associated Republican Steve King was able to retain his seat in a narrow win. That got us to yesterday, when the House had a hearing where they questioned Google CEO Sundar Pichai. The idea, I guess, was to explore bias in search results, sort of, but the questions were mostly uninformed and based in vague conspiracy theories about Google manipulating search results and a total lack of practical technology knowledge by the members of the committee. And at one point during these hearings, Steve King, who again is a totally clueless guy tied to white nationalists, one of the worst Republicans in the House of Representatives, he angrily demanded answers from Google's CEO about how an iPhone works, which of course is not made by Google. It's made by Apple, which is actually sort of a competitor to Google, at least on some platforms. There is so much going on in the clip I'm about to play for you that I want to prepare you for it. So number one, you'll notice that when Steve King asks this question to Sundar Pichai, he actually hesitates for a second. Sundar does. You can see him weighing the options and debating in his own mind. Do I give some kind of diplomatic answer about how iPhones work? Or do I treat this guy like the moron that he is and explain that Google just simply doesn't make the iPhone? Watch for that crucial moment where you can see him running through the possibilities in his head. You're also going to notice that in the background of the video, there's someone dressed like the Monopoly guy, like from the board game Monopoly. That's Ian Madrigal, who has shown up before at hearings dressed as Uncle Pennybags from Monopoly to call attention to the lobbying money that floats around Congress. So all of that and more is happening in this clip. Let's take a look.
I have a 7-year-old granddaughter who picked up her phone before the election, and she's playing a little game, kind of game a kid would play, and up on there pops a picture of her grandfather. And I'm not going to say into the record what kind of language was used around that picture of her grandfather, but I'd ask you, how does that show up on a 7-year-old's iPhone who's playing a kid's game?
Congressman, iPhone is made by a different company, and so, you know, I mean...
it might have been an Android. It's just, it was a hand-me-down of some kind.
You know,
I'd ask...
I'm happy to follow up and understand the specifics. There may be an application which was being used, which had a notification, but I'm happy to understand it better and clarify it for you.
Okay. Thank you for your testimony, and yield back the balance of my time. Appreciate it.
This is just amazing. And the defenders are saying, oh, listen, the question could have applied to Android or iPhone. It's such a stupid question. I mean, quite frankly, it's such a stupid question. And so that's like the headline, goofy, outrageous clip. But there's actually plenty of Democrats and Republicans exposing how clueless they are about how the internet works during this hearing. Here's another one. This is Congressman Lamar Smith, a Republican from Texas. He asks Google's CEO to confirm that Google has never punished anybody for manipulating search results. And Google's CEO says no, because no individual person can do that. Take a look.
Number two, also to my knowledge, you've never sanctioned any employee for any type of, for manipulating the search results whatsoever. Is that the case?
The time of the gentleman has expired, but Mr. Pichai will be allowed to answer the question.
And very quickly, it's not possible for an individual employee or groups of employees to manipulate our search results. You know, we have a robust framework, including many steps in the process.
Well,
so
my time is up. Let me just say I disagree. I think humans can manipulate the process. It is a human process at its base. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Chair recognizes.
This is just the best. Lamar Smith disagrees. He knows nothing about anything, but he disagrees. His feelings override the facts. He feels like individual employees can mess with search results and he wants them punished, even though that's not how it works. Now, of course, I know in some broad sense, it's true, right? I mean, humans made Google, so humans control how the algorithm works. But the idea that you'd punish individuals for manipulating search results is a bit silly, and it just shows how clueless Lamar Smith is. There are other clips if you want to see more. Steve King is a moron. We know that. His constituents had a chance to vote him out. They opted to reelect him. Okay. The bigger picture from these hearings is that it exposes that we have members of Congress who don't know a thing about technology in charge of figuring this stuff out. This is why, instead of mostly older lawyers and CEOs from industry, we need younger people. We need people from more diverse backgrounds, scientists, people from more diverse professions. Case in point, we found out after Republican Senator Lindsey Graham had been on some tech committee, maybe it was cybersecurity, don't remember exactly. He had been on this committee for a while. It was revealed that he had never sent an email in his life. Lindsey Graham's 63 years old. Email has been around in some form since he was 17 years old. Admittedly, it wasn't ubiquitous back then, but it's been around and commonly used since Lindsey Graham was in his mid-30s. Pat, why does he have to be on a cybersecurity or tech committee if he's never even sent an email? Like, is this really the best that we can do?
This is the best that we have. Like you said, most of these people are lawyers and they've been politicians for decades, so they don't understand tech. And it's not to say that they can't ask tough questions. I think they can, and they can press these CEOs and make sure that they get to the bottom of things. But they should do less grandstanding and more listening at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, just the questions expose how little they understand about how things work. And I'm reminded of that law. Someone at one point in New York State got off on child porn charges because of how the law was written. Just viewing child porn is not possessing it because you didn't like right click save as to your computer. And this allowed people, at least one person, potentially more, to get out of child porn charges. Then they went in and changed the law. And it's this kind of reactive situation. We need, on issues of technology and cybersecurity, we need our elected officials to be proactive. You can't be proactive unless you have some understanding of what the hell is going on. However impressive it might be what Barron Trump is doing with computers, we actually need our elected officials, not the children of presidents, to be knowledgeable, informed, and working for us and proactively rather than seemingly indifferent to how the real world actually operates when it comes to these technologies. I mean, just embarrassing in every way. And hopefully, I mean, the upside is that Steve King's cartoonish demand of Sundar Pichai to explain how an iPhone works, even though Apple makes iPhone, not Google, if it serves the purpose of bringing this hearing out into the open so more people realize the degree of cluelessness that our elected officials have on these issues, I would consider that a benefit, a net gain of Steve King saying really dumb things.